People thousands of years ago were more clever and resourceful than we often give them credit for, especially when it came to war. Ancient engineers built things that were way ahead of their time, creating machines that could shoot multiple arrows in seconds, steel that didn't break, and fires that couldn't be put out on water. Looking back at history, it seems almost impossible that people could make these things with the simple tools they had, but these are ancient weapons so advanced they shouldn't have existed. For hundreds of years, the Byzantine Empire had a secret weapon that absolutely terrified anyone who tried to attack them by sea. It's a special kind of liquid fire. The scariest part about it was that if you poured water on it, the fire didn't go out. It actually seemed to get hotter and burn even worse. The people who ran the empire kept the recipe completely secret. They knew that if anyone else figured out how to make it, the empire would be in big trouble. Because they kept it a secret for so long, the exact recipe disappeared when the empire finally fell. Today, scientists guess that it had oil, tree sap, and sulfur in it, but nobody knows the real mixture for sure. The weapon was first used in the late 600s when a massive fleet of ships came to attack the capital city of Constantinople. The Byzantine ships had big bronze tubes on the front that worked just like modern flamethrowers. They blasted this burning goo straight at the enemy boats, and because the stuff was sticky, it clung to the sails and the wooden sides of the ships. The emperors treated this secret like the most valuable thing they owned. One emperor even wrote down a rule saying that there were 3 things the empire must never give away to outsiders: royal crown, the royal princesses, and Greek fire. When you think about the ancient Roman army, you probably picture soldiers holding big red shields and short iron swords, but they also used a weapon that worked almost like a modern sniper. It was called the Scorpio. It was a relatively small shooting machine that could throw heavy iron bolts across a field with incredible speed. It was also incredibly accurate. It got its power from thick bundles of rope made from animal muscles and hair. The operators would use a crank to twist these ropes tighter and tighter, and the ropes were twisted all the way back. They held a massive amount of energy. The moment the trigger was pulled, the rope snapped back and shot the bolt forward. The Romans brought these machines with them wherever they went. They'd set them up on top of stone walls, high towers, or wooden carts with wheels. The crews who ran them were highly trained. Old history books say that instead of just shooting blindly into a big crowd of enemies, a good Scorpio operator could aim at a single person hundreds of feet away and hit them dead on. The machine had another great feature. It was small and light, at least compared to the giant catapults that threw heavy rocks. This meant the Roman soldiers could pick it up and move it to different spots, battlefield very quickly if the situation changed. Romans were able to hit targets from a fair distance with near perfect precision, something most other armies could not match for centuries. For a Viking, a good sword was a matter of life and death. Most swords back then were made of cheap iron that held a lot of dirt and air bubbles inside, which meant it could bend or snap right in the middle of a fight. But there was one specific type of sword that was better than all the rest. Archaeologists digging in Europe have found about 170 of these special blades, and they all have the exact same name stamped into the metal: Ulfbert. These swords are so well made that modern metal experts are still confused about how ancient blacksmiths pulled this off. The metal used in a real Ulfbert sword was incredibly clean steel with a lot of carbon mixed in. This made the blade strong enough to smash through armor, but flexible enough that it wouldn't snap when hit with something hard. Scientists found out that this metal was made using a super hot melting process that regular European blacksmiths didn't figure out how to do consistently until hundreds of years later. Experts think the raw metal actually came from trade routes that went all the way down into Central Asia and Persia, where people already knew how to make ultra pure steel. Because these swords were the best in the world, they were incredibly expensive. Only the richest Viking leaders could afford one. In fact, the swords were so famous that other blacksmiths started making fake ones to trick people. Modern researchers have found cheap, low-quality swords with misspelled versions of the Ulfbert name stamped on them. Even today, though, scientists can instantly tell a real one from a fake just by looking at how clean the metal is under a microscope. Long ago, fighters in the Middle East carried swords that became legendary because of how they looked and how sharp they were. They were called Damascus steel swords, named after a famous city in Syria where people bought and sold them. But the special metal used to make them actually came from India in the form of small metal bricks. You could instantly spot one of these swords because the metal had beautiful wavy lines running all through it, looking almost like water flowing down the blade. But those lines were not just for decoration. They were a sign that the metal had been heated and folded in a very specific way. The result was a blade that was extremely hard but also bendable, meaning it could hold a razor-sharp edge without without cracking. Old stories from the Middle Ages claim these swords were so sharp they could slice through a metal helmet or even cut a piece of silk fabric floating in the air. Some of those stories might be exaggerated, but the blades really were incredible. Making these swords was an art form that took blacksmiths a lifetime to learn. They had to know exactly how hot to make the fire and exactly how fast to cool the metal down. And sometime in the 1700s, people stopped making them. A lot of historians think this was thanks to trade routes changing. The blacksmiths couldn't get the special metal blocks from India anymore, and because the method for making the blades was passed down by word of mouth and never actually written down, the exact method for making a real Damascus steel was lost forever. Before anyone had firearms, the Song dynasty in China came up with something called the fire lance. It was a long spear with a hollow tube strapped to the front. At first they used bamboo for the tube, later on they switched to metal, but inside that tube they packed gunpowder along with bits of metal, rocks, and broken pottery, and when a soldier lit the powder, it fired this huge blast of flame, thick smoke, and nasty sharp trash right into the enemy's face. Now, it wasn't great at hitting specific targets far away. If you wanted to shoot someone from a distance, you still used a bow, but close up, this was terrifying. I mean, imagine charging into the battle with a spear, but right before you poke the guy in front of you, this massive explosion erupts right in your face. Not only would you be lucky to survive the blast, but if you are on horseback, good luck. Send your steed into a total panic. The fire lance changed fighting forever. For thousands of years, every weapon relied on human muscles to do the damage. Fire lance changed that by using chemical explosions to fight instead. And over time, people kept tweaking this very simple idea. They made the tube stronger, dropped the spear part, made the heavy pieces fit together tightly inside. That's how we got hand cannons and muskets, and eventually, of course, the firearms we have today. Back when Rome was starting to grow, they ran into a bit of an issue. They had to fight Carthage, the top power on the sea. Rome had a great army on land, but on the water, they were totally out of their depth, no pun intended. Carthage had better boats, experienced captains and sailors who lived on the water. In a normal sea battle, Rome was gonna lose. Instead of learning how to fight on sea overnight, Roman engineers got creative. They decided to stop playing Carthage's game and force Carthage to play theirs. They built a device called the corvus. Corvus was a wooden bridge about 36 feet long, attached to a swivel pole on the front of Roman ships. Underneath the far end of the bridge was this heavy, sharp spike, looked a bit like a bird's beak, which is actually what corvus means in Latin. When a Roman ship pulled up close to an enemy boat, they dropped the bridge, and that heavy metal spike slammed through the wooden deck of the enemy ship, locking the two boats together so nobody could pull away. That turned a sea battle into a land battle pretty quick. Roman soldiers would charge across the bridge, forcing the enemy to fight hand to hand. Carthage's sailors were great at steering boats, but they couldn't hold off trained Roman foot soldiers in a sword fight. If you ask anyone to draw a sword, they'll draw a straight piece of metal meant for swinging or stabbing straight ahead. Shields work really well against those because you just block the incoming hit. But warriors in ancient Ethiopia created a weapon called the shuttle, which had a long blade that curved in a big semicircle, looked like a giant hook. It looked weird, but that curve had a specific job, reaching right around an enemy's shield. When a fighter attacked with a normal sword, a shield easily stopped it. With a shuttle, the warrior swung the blade past the shield. The curved tip would reach behind the shield wall and hook into the opponent's back, neck, or ribs. The shield stayed intact, but the person holding it got hit. Using a shuttle was not easy though. You couldn't just swing it like a stick, or the point would curve back and hit you. It took years of practice to master the wrist movements needed to control the hooked tip, but in the hands of a skilled warrior, it was terrifying. Most ancient throwing weapons were pretty simple. You had spears, small darts, or throwing blades, but in ancient India, warriors came up with something completely different called the chakram. A chakram is a flat metal ring with a razor-sharp edge. The inside edge is smooth so you can hold it, but the outside is deadly. It was basically an ancient, highly dangerous metal frisbee. To throw it, a warrior would spin the ring around their index finger to build up speed and then flick their wrist to launch it. Sometimes they'd also just throw it. Very dangerous, not just for the enemy, but the wielder too, but it was effective. Flew straight through the air over pretty impressive distances. When it hit someone, the spinning edge sliced deep into the skin and bones. Some stories even say these things could chop off limbs. Sikh warriors became famous for using these, wearing multiple chakrams stacked on their tall turbans or slung over their arms. Building a chakram took serious skill though. Ancient blacksmiths had to make sure the circle was perfectly balanced. If one side was slightly heavier than the other, it would wobble in the air and miss the target completely. At first glance, the Roman pilum doesn't look all that impressive. Looks like a spear, but if you look closer at how it was built, realize it was actually a piece of brilliant engineering. Roman soldiers didn't use this spear for poking, they threw it right before they ran into a fight with their swords. When the spear was thrown at an enemy army, it would fly through the air and stick deep into the wooden shields. The moment the spear hit the shield, the long, thin iron neck of the spear would bend under its own weight. And this bending was not an accident. The Romans designed it to do exactly that. See, once the spear bent, it was stuck in the shield like this giant hook. The enemy soldier couldn't pull it out, at least not quickly, because it was bent, and they couldn't fight properly because they now had a heavy 6-foot pole dragging their shield down to the ground. Usually the enemy soldier would just have to drop their shield, leaving them wide open. The bent spear also solved another problem. See, in regular ancient battles, if you threw a spear at an enemy and it missed, they could just pick it up off the ground and throw it right back at you. But because the Roman pilum bent on impact, well, it was now completely useless to the enemy. Pretty brilliant. Most ancient weapons were pretty slow. If you used a regular bow or a standard crossbow, you had to fire one arrow, stop, pull the string back, all your strength, load another arrow, and then aim again. It took a lot of time and effort, but inventors in ancient China came up with a machine that completely changed that. It was called the repeating crossbow. It had a wooden box mounted right on top of the bow that held up to 10 arrows at a time. Instead of loading each arrow by hand, the person holding it just had to push and pull a wooden lever back and forth. Pushing the lever pulled the heavy string back. It automatically dropped a new arrow into the slot. Pulling it back further released the string and fired. You could shoot all 10 arrows in just a few seconds. The only real downside to the repeating crossbow was that it wasn't as strong as a giant heavy crossbow. Because it was built for speed, the arrows didn't fly with enough force to punch through heavy metal armor. To make up for that, those soldiers would often dip the tips of the arrows in poison. But even without the poison, being able to spray a dozen arrows into the air in seconds was terrifying, and clearly a major step forward in how warfare would play out in the future. In the year 214 BCE, the Roman navy sailed up to the Greek city of Syracuse. The Romans had a massive fleet of ships and expected to conquer the city pretty easily. Instead, they ran face first into the inventions of Archimedes, one of the smartest mathematicians and engineers to ever live. He transformed the city walls into a giant defensive machine. He built several strange defense systems, but the one that terrified the Romans the most was a machine later called the claw. It was hidden behind the high stone walls facing the ocean, so the ships couldn't see it as they approached. When a Roman ship got too close to the wall, the Greek defenders would swing a massive wooden crane out over the water. Attached to the end of the crane was a giant iron hook on a rope. The hook would drop down, catch the front of the ship, and latch onto the wood. Using a clever system of heavy weights, ropes, and pulleys inside the city, the defenders would pull down on their end of the crane. This would lift the front of the enemy ship completely out of the water, leaving it hanging in the air. After holding onto it for a moment, they'd release the ropes and let the ship just crash back down to the sea. Archaeologists have never found the broken pieces of this machine, so we don't know exactly what it looked like, but modern engineers have built working models using the same math Archimedes used, and they proved it really does work. It worked so well that Roman soldiers became terrified of anything poking out over the city walls, worried that a giant hand was about to grab them. Back in 1659, a Hindu king named Shivaji was leading a rebellion to carve out an independent kingdom in western India, creating what became the powerful Maratha Empire. But a rival general named Afzal Khan wanted to crush the rebellion and set up a peace summit inside a tent to negotiate. The general tried to strangle Shivaji during a hug, but Shivaji was ready for it. Hidden right inside his left hand was a weapon called the bagnak, or tiger claws. With one fast strike to the guy's stomach, Shivaji ended the fight right then and there. The weapon was pretty simple. It was a metal bar that rested across your palm, held in place by two rings you slipped over your fingers. Because the main bar sat flat inside your hand, you could close your fist and look completely unarmed. Someone looking right at you would have no idea you were holding anything until you made your move. It gave you the ultimate element of surprise without dragging heavy gear or raising red flags with guards searching you for weapons before a meeting. India had a lot of really creative weapons. There's another one coming up on this list that is incredible. During a massive sea war in 36 BCE though, Roman commander Marcus Agrippa ran into an issue. Rome's usual strategy was dropping heavy wooden bridges onto enemy boats to board them. We talked about that in part 2, but those bridges were massive, they were clunky, and they made the ships harder to steer. Agrippa needed a way to snag enemy ships from a safe distance, so he came up with a catapult-fired grappling hook called the harpax. It was essentially a 7-foot wooden beam wrapped in thick iron bands. On one end was a heavy iron hook, on the other was a long rope attached to a winch back on the Roman deck. Instead of throwing hooks by hand, Roman sailors loaded the whole harpax straight into a catapult and shot it across the water like a giant missile. When the iron hook slammed into an enemy ship, it dug deep into the wood. Enemy sailors ran over with axes trying to cut the rope, but Agrippa was one step ahead of them. The front section of the beam was wrapped in solid iron, so axe blades just bounced right off. The Roman crew then yanked their winches, dragging the enemy ship right up next to them so that their soldiers could jump aboard. At the Battle of Naulochus, this thing helped destroy or capture over 180 enemy ships. Around 400 BCE, Greek engineers came up with a handheld bow that didn't rely on your arms to pull the string back. They called it the gastrophides, which translates to belly bow or belly releaser. Normal bows were limited to how strong your upper body was, but this design let a soldier use their entire body weight to load the weapon. The back end had a smooth, curved wooden pad shaped to fit right against your stomach. To load it, you rested the tip on the ground, leaned your whole body over the stock, and shoved your belly hard into the pad. That downward weight pushed a sliding track back, pulling the heavy bowstring until it clicked into a trigger. A built-in ratchet kept the string from snapping back while you were loading it. Because the bow limbs were super thick and stiff, the gastrophides fired heavy wooden bolts with way more power than your standard bow. It could punch straight through armor and wooden shields from distances that normal archers couldn't even reach. When Julius Caesar trapped a massive enemy force at the hill fortress of Alesia in 52 BCE, his army was totally surrounded. To keep the enemy from rushing his lines, Caesar had his engineers build hidden underground traps that worked an awful lot like modern landmines. One of his favorites was a trap called the stimulus. Roman soldiers dug shallow trenches, buried heavy logs in the dirt. Sticking out of those logs were curved iron spikes that looked like giant fish hooks. It covered everything back up with dirt, leaves, and grass so the ground looked normal. When enemy troops came charging across the field, those iron hooks drove right into their feet, locking them in place, tearing through their boots. Right next to those hook traps, the Romans dug hidden pits lined with sharpened wooden stakes and set up spring-loaded metal traps designed to snap shut on anyone's legs. Enemies couldn't charge the Roman lines without stepping on a hidden spike, turning the whole battlefield into a complete gruesome nightmare before hand-to-hand fighting even started. Here's an interesting angle: the Antikythera mechanism. We don't often think of this ancient, mysterious artifact as a weapon, but who knows? Back in 1901, some Greek divers were searching an old shipwreck and dragged up what looked like a crusty green rock. It sat in a museum basement for decades as no one had any idea what it really was. But in the 70s, scientists put it through an X-ray scanner. What they found inside was pretty mind-blowing. Packed inside were dozens of tiny bronze gears, all cut with insane detail, fitting together just like the inside of a mechanical watch. But this thing was built over 2,000 years before. To say this thing was far ahead of its time would be a massive understatement. You turned a little handle on the side, and all the gears inside started turning together. Some of those tiny gear teeth were only as big as a grain of rice. Before finding this, experts thought nobody knew how to make gear systems that advanced until like the 1300s. Completely changed what historians thought about what ancient people were doing with metal. Now, what was this mechanism actually used for? There are plenty of theories, but nobody's been able to say 100% for sure. It's the only one of its kind. Around 213 BCE, the Roman navy sailed a huge fleet of ships to attack the Greek city of Syracuse. They expected an easy win, but Archimedes turned the city's sea walls into a massive line of defense using the sun's reflection. Story goes that he lined up dozens of soldiers along the walls, all holding giant bronze shields that were polished until they worked like mirrors. They angled the shiny shields to catch the sun, bouncing all the rays together into one burning beam of light. Then they aimed that beam straight at the Roman ships sailing into the harbor. Think of it like a kid using a magnifying glass on a sunny day to burn a leaf, but on a massive scale. Once that concentrated beam hit the dry wood and the sails, the boats got so hot they literally burst into flames on the water before they could even get close enough to attack. MIT students tested this years ago with polished bronze plates and actually set a wooden boat on fire from far away. Simple, but highly effective. Next up, we have another really odd artifact. In the late 30s, workers digging near Baghdad found a small clay pot that was over 2,000 years old. Inside was a tube made out of copper, and hanging down the middle of that tube was a single iron rod, sealed in place with tar. Researchers looked at how it was put together. They realized it was built almost identically to a modern battery cell. If you take that clay pot and fill it up with something acidic like simple vinegar or lemon juice, the liquid reacts with the copper and iron to generate a real electrical charge. Nobody was plugging in light bulbs back then, but if you connected a few of these pots together in a row with wire, you'd get enough juice to do some interesting things. Crafty metal workers probably used the electric charge to coat cheap iron jewelry in a paper-thin layer of gold or silver so they could sell it for a higher price. But others think maybe priests used the zaps to give people a little shock during rituals, making them think they were feeling the touch of a god. And of course, these ancient batteries may have been used in warfare at some level. Who knows? About 4,000 years ago, weapons makers in ancient Egypt came up with a blade that completely changed hand-to-hand fighting. It was called the khopesh, half axe, half sword. It started out straight near the handle and then swung into a big curved hook. The unique shape gave a soldier two giant advantages on the battlefield. The outer curved edge was thick and heavy, so when you swung it down, it would hit with the hard force of a heavy axe. But the inside of the curve wasn't sharp at all, working like a giant grappling hook instead. A warrior could swing the blade past an enemy's shield, catch the top of the wood with the hook, and pull it down out of the way. With their chest left completely open, you could land a strike. You could even use the hook to grab someone's ankle and trip them. Casting a big curved blade like that out of hot bronze without it snapping during a fight took crazy skill, which is why it became the favorite weapon for pharaohs and their top commanders for over 1,000 years. Next on the list is the hwacha, built in the late 1400s by inventors in Korea. On the outside, it looked like a simple two-wheeled wooden cart a couple of soldiers could push around, but mounted on top of that cart was a massive wooden launch pad filled with over 100 holes. Each one of those holes held a special arrow called a sing-gi-jan. These weren't normal arrows shot from a bow. They had small gunpowder rockets tied directly to the wooden shafts, and when it was time to fight, the soldier would light a single fuse that connected all those rockets at once. So in this flash of fire and smoke, the cart would unleash a massive swarm of rocket-powered arrows into the sky. This weapon faced its biggest test in the 1590s, when a massive army from Japan invaded Korea. During one famous battle, a small group of Koreans used these rocket carts to hold off an army way bigger than theirs. Wave after wave of rockets filled the sky, creating this wall of fire the enemy just couldn't get through. The hwacha wasn't built for hitting a single target perfectly, like the Scorpio we talked about before. It was just meant to overwhelm the enemy, covering a massive area with fire all at once. Long before anyone invented gunpowder or cannons, ancient Greek engineers figured out how to build a giant machine that could smash through stone walls from far away. This invention was the torsion catapult, and it completely changed how wars were fought around the Mediterranean Sea. When most people think of a catapult, they picture a big, simple piece of wood that would snap forward, but those types of catapults weren't really strong enough to destroy a city. Greeks realized they could get much more power by using a different trick. Similar to the Scorpio we talked about earlier, used bundles of rope made from animal sinew or human hair to load the machine. Soldiers used big gears and cranks to pull the throwing arm backward, and as the arm went back, it twisted the rope bundles tighter, and the tighter they were twisted, the more energy they stored. When the trigger was released, the ropes untwisted, slamming the arm forward with incredible power. The Greeks and later the Romans built these machines in different sizes. During a big battle, an army would line up dozens of these machines outside a city, shoot at the walls for days. The Roman army was the toughest military force around. They had heavy helmets, strong body armor, and large rectangular shields that kept them safe from almost everything. But when Rome marched into Dacia, which is modern-day Romania, they ran into a weapon that scared them so badly they had to change their gear. The weapon was the falx. It was a massive curved blade attached to a long wooden handle, swung using two hands. And unlike a curved blade where the sharp side is on the outside, the falx had its sharp edge on the inside, like a giant tool for cutting tall grass. When a Dacian warrior swung the falx, the heavy blade acted like a hook and an axe at the same time. The sharp point could catch the top of a Roman shield and yank it down, leaving the soldier completely wide open. If a warrior swung it hard enough, the point could chop straight through a Roman helmet or split a wooden shield in half with one blow. Injuries were so awful that Roman troops started panicking. Rome realized very quickly their normal gear was not enough. Before going back into Dacia, Roman generals forced their troops to upgrade. They added thick iron bars to the tops of their helmets so the falx couldn't split their heads open. Hardly any weapon in history ever forced the Roman army to change its equipment like that, but the falx did. Rapid-fire weapons are not a modern idea. Way back around the 3rd century BCE, a Greek engineer named Dionysius of Alexandria built a machine called the polybolus. The name means many thrower. Standard catapults back then had a big flaw. They were slow. A crew had to crank the string back, fire, and repeat the whole thing by hand. It took forever, and while you were reloading, the enemy was of course shooting back. This weapon fixed this with a smart system of gears and chains. It had a wooden box mounted on top that held a stack of wooden arrows. Underneath was a chain drive connected to a hand crank. All the operator had to do was keep turning that crank and pew pew pew. As long as someone kept cranking, another person kept dropping arrows into the box, the polybolus kept shooting without stopping. It was too expensive and complicated to build in huge numbers, so it didn't replace standard weapons everywhere, but the design was way ahead of its time. Before cannons came along, castles were almost impossible to break into. You could sit inside one for months while an army outside starved. But then came the trebuchet, and giant stone walls were a lot less safe. Earlier catapults used twisted ropes like bent wood to launch rocks, and they worked okay for small stones, but they didn't really have real power. The trebuchet relied on heavy weights and gravity instead. They were built like a gigantic seesaw set on a high frame. On the short end of the long wooden beam, engineers hung a massive box filled with tons of rocks, dirt, or lead. On the long end, they attached a rope pouch holding a giant stone. To fire it, a crew pulled the long end down to the ground using ropes and winches, lifting the heavy box high into the air. When they pulled the trigger, that massive counterweight dropped. As the heavy box crashed down, the long end of the beam whipped upward at high speed. The pouch snapped forward at the top and launched the stone with crazy force. Huge trebuchets could throw 300-pound boulders hundreds of yards. When those stones hit a castle wall, the stone defenses would often crumble. During a war in the 2nd century BCE, Greek forces introduced a weird projectile weapon called the kestros. It was a strange mix between a heavy arrow and a throwing dart launched using a sling. Normally, slingers threw small stones or lead balls, and they flew fast, but they mostly just bruised people or at best maybe break a bone. On the other hand, archers shot arrows that could pierce armor, but they didn't hit with much heavy force. The kestros was the best of both worlds. The weapon was a heavy dart made of a solid metal point attached to a wooden stick, with wooden fins on the back to keep it straight. It was about 1.5 feet long. Instead of shooting it from a bow, soldiers used a modified leather sling made specifically to hold the shape of the dart. The slinger would spin the kestros around their head to build up speed and let it fly. Ancient writers said these darts could punch right through wooden shields and thick body armor at really long ranges. We don't have many surviving examples today because the wood and thin metal rot away easily over time. Still, it was a clever way to blend the long range of a sling with the punch of a heavy dart. Trying to break into a walled city was a nightmare. Guards on top of the walls would rain down arrows, boiling liquids of various kinds, rocks and spears on anyone who came close. To get soldiers over or through those walls alive, ancient armies built massive wooden siege towers that carried battering rams inside. These were giant rolling wooden buildings on huge wheels, sometimes standing 5 to 8 stories tall. The outside of the tower was often covered in wet animal skins, metal plates, or thick mud, so it would be harder for the enemy to fire flaming arrows and set them on fire. On the ground floor, hidden under heavy wooden roofs, was a massive battering ram hanging from chains. Teams of men could swing the heavy tree trunk back and forth, smashing it into stone gates. At the same time, the top floors carried troops right up to the enemy's level. Soldiers climbed inside ladders to reach the top, totally protected the whole way up. Once the tower rolled up to the wall, workers dropped a wooden bridge from the top floor, letting dozens of troops run straight on the enemy defenses long before armored vehicles existed. Before steel armor or gunpowder, ancient archers built incredibly strong bows using basic stuff from nature. Regular bows back then were made from just one bendy stick of wood. If you made the stick too stiff, it couldn't pull back, of course, but if you made it too soft, the arrow didn't fly far or with much power. So builders started doing something different. They took a wooden core and glued hard animal horn to the inside curve facing the shooter, because horn is great at being squeezed tight, and they glued stretchy animal tendons to the outside curve facing away, because tendons are great at being pulled long. When this bow was unstrung, it actually curled completely backward into a tight C shape. To string it, you had to forcefully bend the arrow's arms all the way back in the opposite direction, fighting against its natural shape just to hook the string on. That trapped a massive amount of tension inside the frame. The result was a short, lightweight bow. It was easy to shoot from the back of a running horse, say, but fired arrows with twice the power of a giant wooden bow twice its size. But even tens of thousands of years before anyone invented the bow and arrow, Ice Age hunters figured out a simple trick to throw heavy spears with far more force than you'd get by only relying on your body. The tool was called an atlatl. It was basically just a short wooden stick with a handle on one end and a little hook sticking up at the back. You rest the end of a long wooden spear against the back hook, holding the stick flat in your hand. And when you go to throw, the stick acts like a giant extension of your own arm. Think of those plastic dog toys people used to fling tennis balls across a park without hurting their shoulder. That's what this was, except for spears. Instead of just throwing with your arm muscles, you flick your wrist and the extra length of the stick would whip the dart forward. That extra leverage gave ancient humans way more speed and power than muscle alone could ever pull off. The impact was so hard that a stone tip could punch right through the thick skin and bone of a woolly mammoth, but they were able to do this from a much safer distance. You may not know the name of this next weapon, but you've definitely seen it before, like in museums or in movies. Hard to pronounce. The macuatl, the macach. There's a lot of different pronunciations, but when Spanish troops showed up in Central America, they ran into this Aztec weapon that looked like a big wooden cricket bat. It was a lot more terrifying than that, though. These things were carved from thick pieces of wood, about 3 feet long, with deep grooves cut along both side edges. Aztec craftsmen took pieces of obsidian, which is shiny dark volcanic glass, and crushed them into razor-sharp flakes. They glued those glass flakes into the side grooves using sticky tree sap. You could sharpen volcanic glass down to an edge so thin, it can actually get sharper than modern doctors' scalpels, making it way sharper than any European steel sword at the time. Those jagged glass teeth didn't leave clean cuts. They tore through anything they touched. Old reports from Spanish soldiers mention an Aztec warrior taking off a horse's entire head with one solid swing. While smaller launchers handled quick shooting, the Roman army rolled out the giant ballista when they needed to break down heavy stone walls. It looked like a giant wooden crossbow, but it didn't get its launching power from bent wood. It used pure twisting force. Engineers built a massive wooden frame housing 2 giant vertical bundles of rope made from tightly twisted animal tendons and human hair. They'd stick wooden arms into the middle of those rope bundles and crank them back with iron winches, twisting the ropes tighter and tighter like a bunch of pulled rubber bands. When you pulled the trigger, those twisted rope bundles snapped forward. The power was enough to launch heavy iron bolts or 100-pound boulders over 4 football fields away. The stone hit with so much force it could crack stone defenses. In the late 1700s, the kingdom of Mysore in southern India completely changed warfare by building the world's first successful iron-cased rockets. Before this, early rockets in China and Europe used paper or bamboo tubes to hold gunpowder, and the big problem was that paper and wood would burst open easily when the powder caught fire, which limited how far they could fly and how much powder you could pack inside. Indian rulers Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan fixed this by hammering soft iron into solid, seamless metal tubes instead. The heavy iron was strong enough to hold the burning powder under massive pressure without blowing apart, sending the rockets flying through the air over a mile. To keep them flying straight, they also strapped long 8-foot bamboo poles to the side to balance them. Whole squads of soldiers would line up rows of these metal rockets on carts and launch massive barrages into enemy lines, and when British forces saw these things in action, they took the designs back home to build their own metal rocket systems. Back in the 6th century BCE, elite Persian warriors carried a short sword called the akanakis. It was a straight double-edged blade about 18 inches long, built specifically for fast thrusts in tight spaces. While most weapons back then were pretty rough pieces of iron, these were built with incredible precision. Persian blacksmiths figured out how to forge tough iron blades that could hold a sharp edge without snapping on impact. The handles were not only perfectly balanced to fit the hand, they also had really cool, intricate designs, often shaped like animal heads. What really made the high-end version stand out was the scabbard. Wealthy Persian nobles had wooden sheaths covered in thin sheets of gold, carved with detailed scenes of lion hunts and mythical beasts. And they used a special side loop that made the whole sword hang sideways across the right hip. That placed the handle at an exact angle for this fast, fluid draw in one motion. Starting around 400 BCE, blacksmiths in Celtic Europe developed a blade called the latten sword. For this, most swords were short, rigid pieces of metal made mostly for thrusting. If you made an iron sword too long back then, it would just snap or bend when you hit something hard. Well, Celtic smiths solved this using a technique similar to early pattern welding. They took strips of high carbon steel and soft iron, bundled them together, heated them up, and hammered them into a single blade. The hard steel gave the sword a razor-sharp edge. The soft iron absorbed the shock of a heavy swing. So this let them build long, double-edged swords over 30 inches that could bend under pressure but then snap right back into shape without breaking. When Roman soldiers first fought Celtic warriors, they were shocked by how long and tough their swords were. The Celtic fighter could swing one from horseback or on foot, delivering huge blows that cleaved straight through wooden shields and leather armor. This design ended up setting the standard for European sword making for hundreds of years. Standard crossbows were great, but they were slow. You had to shoot, stop, pull the heavy string back, load a new bolt, and aim all over again. But in ancient China, engineers came up with a repeating crossbow called the Ju Ganu. It fired bolts in rapid succession using a simple hand lever. Mounted right on top of the weapon was a wooden box magazine that held up to 10 short arrows. The soldier pulled the rear handle back, the mechanism pulled the bowstring into place, while a new arrow dropped out of the box. Pushing the lever forward, released the string and fired the bolt. A trained soldier could empty all 10 arrows in about 15 seconds. There was a drawback though. Heavy firing power was swapped out for speed, so these short bolts didn't hit hard enough to punch through thick metal armor. To fix that, Chinese armies coated the iron arrow tips in deadly plant poison, so the arrow itself didn't get you, the poison would. Originating in southern India, the arumi is easily one of the strangest weapons ever created. At first glance, it looks like a long leather belt, but when you unbuckle it, you get a handle attached to thin, flexible steel blades that stretch up to 6 feet long. The metal is treated to be extremely flexible, while keeping razor-sharp edges on both sides. It's basically a whip made out of metal. You can't block or strike with it like a normal sword. Instead, fighters would swing the arumi in circles around their bodies. Nobody would want to get anywhere near that. Controlling it would take insane practice. If you stop your swing too fast or you mess up the angle, the blade could whip right back and hit you instead. Because of that, fighters trained with cloth strips for years before using real metal. But in the hands of an expert, a single person with an arumi could hold off an entire group of attackers at once. During the late Roman era, engineers took massive bulky siege catapults and shrank them down into a portable metal shooting machine called the chirobalestra. Older catapults relied on big wooden frames that would often warp in damp weather. They also just took up a ton of space. The Romans fixed this by making the core frame out of solid bronze and iron. The power came from 2 hollow metal cylinders mounted on the sides, and inside those cylinders were tightly twisted bundles of animal muscle and rope under huge tension. Because the metal frame was so much stronger than wood, they could pack way more power into a much smaller design. The curved shape of the frame also allowed the arms to swing back further, transferring maximum energy into the shot. Instead of needing a whole squad of men to haul it around too, this thing was light enough to move quickly across a battlefield. Launched heavy arrows with insane speed, punching right through body armor with a lot of accuracy. The sleek metal design also looked way ahead of its time, giving the Romans a piece of high-tech precision artillery long before modern machinery existed.